Hi Year 11s, we're at the point now where we need to keep reflecting on our writer's statement and our annotations. I've added a couple of videos to this presentation to help jog your memory in terms of any of the content that you'll find in this PowerPoint presentation. So let's talk about what is a writer's statement. So a writer's statement is a reflective piece of writing which explains the decisions you made were done with a purpose in mind. So this is why early on in the process we identified, well, what's our purpose, who's our target audience, and what form will our cover take. The writer's statement is where you explain all your creative decisions and why you constructed the text the way you did. Thinking about the very first assignment, you will still need to show that you can analyse the language techniques that you have actually included in your cover. You also need to explicitly and clearly identify what your purpose was for the creation, remembering that we looked at 4 different purposes generally for magazine covers, being you want to entice the reader to buy the magazine, you might want to create controversy, you might like to just attract attention, and also draw the reader in. Those 4 different purposes can be found on your Achieving AP1 resource, as well as some of the earlier resources in the first assignment. And you also need to tell me really clearly who your target audience was. So let's think about what should we be writing about specifically. So again, no matter if you're doing your annotations or you're doing your writer's statement, all of this is relevant to you. So you need to be telling me, what did you intend to achieve, so the magazine cover purpose, and how did you go about achieving it? So again, being really explicit about who your intended audience was, and then going to that next step and saying, well, how did you actually target them? So think back to when we did the Women's Weekly cover, and I gave it to you in black and grey and white, and we started looking at all the different elements, and we said, okay, let's look at the masthead, Women's Weekly. And then we started saying, well, who does that actually appeal to? So we know that they were singling out women. And then we started thinking about, well, what kind of colour palette would we apply to this magazine cover? Okay, that idea of colour theory. And then we started talking about stereotyping. So we know that women are usually, I guess, attracted to that pink or purple kind of colour. And that's why we decided that as a class, potentially we could be adding like that pink, the maroon, splash of white, maybe even gold. Okay, so you'd be looking about how did you target your audience? You might have used colour. You might have looked at the different kinds of font that you've used. Have you used a specific language that is age appropriate? And potentially you might have just used images that are linked to the interest of that age group or the gender that you are trying to target. With your font, you might also like to look at, did you bold specific words or specific cover lines? Did you use italics or did you underline anything? And how is that actually meeting a purpose, like attracting attention or drawing the reader in? You also need to analyse and explain those structural features. So we looked at that in Achieving AP1 as well, your layout and your formatting. So why did you choose one layout over another? We've looked at 2 specific layouts, being the L shape and the U shape. So you need to identify which one you've chosen, and then you need to give me a reason. Why did you choose one over the other? Was there better readability? Was there more space? Was it just easier on the eyes? Okay. And then you might like to look at why did you decide to place your elements in the specific order in the specific way you did? You might have had some of your cover lines scattered. Why was some cover lines bigger than another? Did you use sub-images and did you make them symmetrical, so one either side? And why would you have done that? How does that appeal to your audience? Lucky last, identifying and analysing the effects of the language features you've included. So again, you have that nice little booklet that we started looking at, well, what actually is a hyperbole? What is a rhetorical question? Making sure you know what the function of each of those techniques are so that you can explain your example in depth. So pretty much all you're doing is explaining all your choices in as much detail as you can with reference to AP1. Okay, as you can see down here, you must focus on analysing why you chose a technique or structural feature, what the effect or the intended effect is, and how it contributes to you achieving a specific purpose that you should have already identified. And just like with practice, you will need to include quotations from your own work to actually identify what you've done before you can start explaining and elaborating. So I've given you a little bit of an example for what you might like to do in terms of including quotations in your cover. Okay, so I said, one, you need to meet your communication performance standards. Some of us needed to be perhaps a little more careful about meeting communication 1 and 2 in the last assignment, and your feedback will come in really handy. Okay. What's really important is that your sentences will flow and they'll be coherent, so I must be able to understand them really clearly. And I can't understand them really clearly if you have just lonely quotations sitting around that are disjointed from your sentences. And again, if your quotations are not connected to your sentences, then you are at risk of not meeting AP1 to the best of your ability. So you can see down the bottom here that I have a good example and a not so great example. So you can see that St Martin's the biggest and best in the southeast, and that's just a little quotation there, just sitting there, not really integrated into a sentence, and then I start rambling off that this is an example of, and it would be hyperbole. Okay, that's not really what we want to see. What we really want to see is a little bit of sentence before and after your quotation. So I already know that biggest and best are exaggerations, so therefore it's a hyperbole. So at the beginning of my sentence, I'm going to start saying something like, hyperbole was present in the cover line, and then I'm going to insert my quotation. What's really good about this lovely green approved quotation integration example is that I've used correct vocabulary in terms of cover line. Okay. And then I've said, okay, hyperbole was present in the cover line, St Martin's, the biggest and the best in the southeast, to exaggerate that, and then I could continue elaborating as to why I used it. What's important to remember is that you should be writing in past tense. You have already created the cover and now you're just reflecting on it. You should always try to be objective and write without the I statements, exactly like you would in an essay. I've given you quite a lengthy example here about how you might like to write without the I statement so that you don't get tripped up. And what I suggest is potentially you might like to use this example and perhaps just plug in, instead of rhetorical question, if you've used emotive language, you can just say emotive language was incorporated into the cover line, and then you would give your own example of what you've used. Here is that example again, annotated by me to show you why it is actually a good example. So I would suggest you have a close look. Again, a few other things to remember. Try and vary your sentence starters and your language. You don't want to say the same sentence starter over and over and over because it gets quite repetitive and you just sound like a broken record. And it's really quite boring to read, and it's not showing that you really are incorporating any depth or understanding in the way that different techniques are used for different purposes. So a couple of examples here. The U layout was applied. Okay, the blue, red and yellow colour scheme was designed to. The masthead was situated at. So I'm using just different describing words before I continue with my elaboration and analysis, explaining why I did it and for what purpose. I also just suggest that, again, if you're struggling with your communication, just use shorter sentences. I would rather you use shorter sentences than misuse commas. Because if you misuse commas, I mark you down. If you use short sentences, it's not 100% perfect, but at least it's coherent and it's clear. And also 100% proofread, and out loud, guys. I've included a few comma rules just in case you might like to check up on what they are so that you do not get caught out like last time. and you will notice that I have given you a checklist to follow. It's not exhaustive, but it really will give you perhaps a little bit of a guide as you are moving through. But again, remembering those 3 key aspects: just tell me what you did, tell me why you did it, and for what purpose and effect. Again, please use each other as a resource when I'm on camp. Have those big discussions about techniques, about the different elements. You are each other's resources, okay? It's really wonderful to have those discussions and then come back to your work as an individual and go, okay, how can I apply these discussions to my work? How can I reflect back on the resources I have and all the knowledge I've learned thus far? I really look forward to reading your annotations and your writer statements, and I hope you have a good week.